Good morning. I am joined this morning by Joel Barolsky. Welcome to the Resolution Room, Joel.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, listen, let me give an intro as best I can, but it's been a long story, your engagement with law and professional services, about 30 years, but you effectively run Barolsky Advisors. So you're a strategic advisor to law firms, big, small and medium effectively, and you've done that for a long period of time, professional services more broadly. You sit on the as a fellow at the Melbourne Law School where you teach the business of law. You've got an interest in another consultancy, I think it's called Edge Consultancy, and you've run, until recently you were part of the co-author, I think, of Thomson Reuters in terms of the state of the Australian market for a couple of years. Is that a fair summary? Have I done it justice, Joel?
I think you've done that justice. The only other bit is that for the last 3 years, I've chaired the Managing Partners Forum, which is probably the sort of most significant congregation of managing partners across Australia, and done that for the last 3 years. And I'm scheduled to be the chair again in 2026. So that also helps me sort of stay in touch with what's happening in the market.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. So I guess it begs the first question: how did you find your way into law and professional services?
By pure chance. I'm not a lawyer by background, but when I first came to Australia around 36 years ago, I worked for the Melbourne Business School, which is part of the University of Melbourne. And I was employed as a case study researcher and writer. So I wrote case studies used on the MBA program and executive education programs. And about 6 months after I arrived, a knock on my door and a chap by the name of George Beaton said, "Hi, I'm doing some work with a law firm called Phillips Fox, and I need an extra pair of hands. Would you be interested in coming to work with me?" And as a full-time academic, you're entitled to do one-day paid outside consulting work. And so I started to work with George for about 6 years part-time while I was at the business school, and then joined his practice full-time and worked with him for 16 years, headed the strategy practice at Beaton Research and Consulting, and then left about 13 years ago to set up on my own. So George was my mentor, and sort of learned the craft of consulting to professional services really through him. So it was really through chance.
Yeah, and your consulting practice is broad in the sense that you work with all firms, don't you, across the market effectively?
That's correct. The majority are sort of medium to large size. But in the last 12 months, I've worked with one or two of the sort of the mega firms across Australia, and sort of tier one national firms, but also I've worked with a few, small boutique firms as well. So it does cross the range, and also a couple of in-house legal teams as well.
Gotcha. Well, I might start, Joel, if we can, with then a broader market scan, because you're really familiar with the Australian legal services market. I love this type of conversation. I'm really deeply interested in it. So let me start by this question. Where do you see it now in terms of, do you see what I think I'm seeing, which is kind of the rise of some global behemoths, if I can call it that, a mid-tier which is strong but largely undifferentiated, that there may be further consolidation, and then of course you've got, with tech, etc., you've got the emergence of the small boutique specialist players as well. Is that a fair summary of some of the pressure points? Or you don't agree with the global statement?
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with the global statement.
Yeah, I wondered that.
Just picking up on that particular attribute, I mean, firstly, the first global firm in Australia arrived in 1964, Baker McKenzie. And so they've been here 61 years. And we then had an influx of global firms about 12, 13 years ago. And really the last major international firm to come to Australia was Denton's about 9 years ago. And we've had one significant exit, which was Hogan Lovells, which left last year. There's not, the sort of rise of the globals, not really. Yes, you have firms like an Ashurst and Herbert Smith Freehills and others, which are part of global tie-ups. And they've, some have increased, some have decreased, but that's just the usual ebbs and flows of the market and the competition that goes on. And so I don't really support that notion of the sudden rise of these global firms, or they suddenly got a significant edge over other firms. Take a Gilbert and Tobin, for example.
Yeah, good example.
It's an outstanding firm, succeeding, performing particularly well, and has done so the last
30 years, 20 years, 30 years. Okay, well, what about obviously a point that you made in a video that I watched, and I guess now we're in October, so it was the early days of 2025. You were talking about effectively a premium end of the market, if you like, getting more expensive, price differentiation compared with a lower tier. And I wonder if tech is also, and commoditisation of law will drive that extreme, if you like, between the top tier and the rest. Where are you on that?
So if you look back at the last sort of 12 years of the legal market in Australia, it really can be divided into sort of three phases or three parts. The first sort of 4 years of those 12 years, really the market was flat. There was no demand growth. There was really no price increases, and things were just flatlining. The next sort of 3 years were characterized by significant demand growth, but not much price growth. So yes, revenues raised, but mostly because of client demand. So we had initially the Hayne Royal Commission into the banking and finance sector. Then we had COVID and sort of free capital, but also a whole lot of regulatory change in and around that time, and that drove a lot of work, legal work. So that was that sort of middle period. And then the last sort of 2-3 years, we've actually had sort of flat growth in terms of hours or actual volume of demand, but the revenue increases come mostly through price. That's how firms have continued to grow, mainly through pricing. Now, this is at an aggregate level.
Yeah. So
the big question is where to in the next 3 or 4 years. So if those are the three phases, what's the general trend? And my prediction and sense, and it's very hard, but generally speaking, I think the underlying demand growth will be steady. There's no massive driver of accelerated growth. We don't foresee a major M&A boom.
Yeah.
There's no massive regulatory change, but the ongoing, Australia is still in a growing economy. You still have regulations coming in and regulators that are quite aggressive. You do have these sort of mega trends around energy transition, around data, AI, digital transformation. You do have those sort of ongoing developments which drive some growth. So I expect volume to be not stellar, but not terrible either. So it will sort of continue. So what's going to happen on price? It's a tricky one. I don't think there's going to be a sort of a binary sort of uniform, yes, prices are just going to go up or just going to go down. I think critically in some areas, driven partly by AI, but areas where there's perhaps low judgment, time-intensive work areas, price will go down. Clients will demand some efficiency dividend.
The commoditization of...
That's right. So there'll be aspects to some of that work which the price will go down, but some of the sort of the advisory elements or components of that work will probably go up. And so it's coming quite nuanced.
I want to go back to a point that you made and pick your brain on it. Let's say if you look at the UK, the influx of private equity money and roll-ups, you don't see that happening at the mid-tier level in the Australian market?
I think there'll be some firms that go down the private equity route, and we've already saw last week, Hamilton Locke have sort of indicated that they're looking to secure some third-party investment. And you do have already in Australia, I think 3 or 4 firms that have some third-party capital or third-party ownership. So you have a firm like Watson and Carney, you have Meridian Lawyers, which is co-owned by 2 of its major clients. You have Keypoint, which is partly owned through its a UK listed entity. So you already do have some of those players in the Australian market. And yes, you'll find some firms that will see the sort of the cash benefits of getting a private equity house to invest and buy part of their capital and realize some of their value or the capital in their business. Yes, you'll see some firms that will accept that. Generally, there are exceptions, and there's some firms where it makes sense, but for a traditional commercial business law firm partnership to seek that kind of investment, I'm I think it benefits the incumbent partners.
Yeah,
Will make them,
more than the legacy in the future.
but it's at the expense of the next generation of future owners. It's really it's sort of at the expense of clients in a way, and I can't see what's in it for the client. And ultimately, to be honest, ironically, I think it's at the expense of the private equity, houses. There's not this middle management to sort of, fire, or to there's not all these efficiency dividends that can come. Law firms are not capital intensive businesses. In the main, there are some where capital can play a role in some acquisitions in some areas, and some parts do require some investments in technology. But by and large, law firms can access cheap capital, relatively cheap capital, from their partners or from the bank or from other sources. That doesn't mean they have to give up control or go down a private equity route, where culturally that's quite a big change from where they're operating at the moment.
It's a good point. The other point that you made was the rise of consultancy, and particularly with, I guess, some brand damage of the Big Four in the Australian market and globally. Like you look at Ashurst, you look at Minters. Do you think the law firms might achieve what the Big Four haven't been able to achieve in terms of eating up some of that consultancy market? And by the say haven't achieved, I mean the Big Four haven't achieved that in legal services is what I was intending to convey.
There are these sort of areas of overlap, or I suppose some of the big law firms have gone into these adjacent practices of consulting services around risk advisory and compliance. They've found a market there. But I do think that post the PwC scandal, I think particularly government and other major clients are quite concerned about conflicts and want their lawyers to be truly independent. I think there'll be some limits to how far law firms can get into some of those consulting areas. It sort of almost gets to this. It's a different issue, but the big four accounting firms had issues of both being the auditor,
exactly, and the consultant
at the same time, and I think law firms, will hit up against some of those similar conflict issues in due course. But in terms of the Big Four in law, again, I've been a bit negative on that. I suppose over the years they've tried twice, and in my view, failed twice. And again, from a client perspective, clients sort of see through the one-stop shop proposition and don't really buy it. And so, I can't see them coming back. They may provide a particular benefit in a managed service type model.
Yeah.
Doing one, particular types of legal work, but as a heavy hitting competitor to an Allens or a Cause or a Gilbert and Tobin or an Ashurst, I just don't see it.
All right, well, that was a really good market scan. I really appreciate your views, Joel. You've been looking at professional services firm for 30 years. You've seen those that grow and those that die on the vine a bit. So what's the key differentiators? What makes a firm successful? What have been the leadership attributes or the cultural attributes?
It's a very complex question, but I thought I'd share with you some work. Actually, my former colleague, George Beaton, and I did. We actually sat down one day and asked ourselves this question: why do some firms fly and why do some fail? Like, why do some fall over? And we developed a framework. It's quite a simple framework, and some of the elements are quite self-evident, but it's a useful way and diagnostic to point to success and failure. And I'll just quickly run through it because it's
interesting.
Sort of answers your question. The first is this idea of around shared direction or a clear and compelling strategy. So choosing to compete in the right markets with the right model. And so an example perhaps is that of a firm that failed was a firm called, be careful what I say, but a firm called Kem Strang, which is no longer with us, now part of Thomson Gear, and they focused a lot on sort of retail mortgage processing work for the big banks. It was a very, very commoditized area of work, and they sort of never quite got the scale to make that viable. But also because that firm had such a strong focus in that area, it found it hard to attract good people in other commercial areas, whether it's employment or general corporate or in other litigation areas. So that strategy, in a way, didn't allow that firm to succeed. The second factor is around shared values or a strong culture. And again, a firm that no longer is with us is a brilliant firm called Henry Davis York.
Yeah.
And to my knowledge, from speaking to various partners who were part of that firm, one of the reasons for that firm not being with us, that really there were two sort of subcultures within that particular firm. One that was really quite driven in terms of making the firm a brilliant place to work, and another group that was very focused on the firm as being a very strong financial performer. And for many years, the firm was successful enough for those two camps to reconcile, and they had an outstanding managing partner, Steve Purcell, for many years, who provided a useful bridge. But Steve moved on. Some of the firm didn't perform as well because of particular focus in insolvency, and the insolvency market wasn't as strong as it had been in previous years. And so those differences became more pronounced. And there's a lot of other factors, but ultimately some major people left the firm, and they decided to join Norton Rose. And so the sort of these cultural differences were the reason that firm didn't fly. The third factor is a little bit more subtle, which is around shared power. And again, you can run a whole podcast on that if you want. But again, it's the way firms are led and governed to give effect to both directed power, so power from the center, but also that individuals feel empowered, that they feel if they want to fly, they're given wings. But also there's power in the collective. These firms are still partnerships and want to feel part of things. And so again, some firms struggle when, for example, they've had a strong benevolent dictator who's led the firm to growth, and then suddenly that person leaves, and sometimes there's a power vacuum, and firms do struggle in those particular periods. The fourth factor is this idea of shared pie, or a
remuneration model, yeah.
Partner remuneration model that's perceived to be fair and equitable, but has also had some flex, but also aligned to the culture and the strategy of the firm. There's no one perfect model. But again, you see some firms where, particularly some smaller firms, where some equity partners have held on to their equity for way too long. They haven't allowed others to sort of come into the tent. And ultimately, the rising stars all leave, and those firms just haven't really realized their potential. And then the last factor is sort of, it's not a shared thing, it's a leadership and management, and really, getting those firms well led and being very efficient and effective, and that makes a critical difference. So it's a very long answer to your question.
They're great 5 factors. I want to go back to the first one, or one of them. I can't now remember, but the point around strategy. I love the work of Michael Porter, who says something along the lines of strategy is as much about what you don't do compared with what you do. And have you seen that laser focus on your market and your clients?
I think that there's a truth in that, but it's an interesting one, because you do see some firms that and very successful firms in the mid-market in Australia who are full service firms, essentially. They may not do criminal law, but they're pretty close to almost everything else. And they service a broad church of clients, from ranging from big corporates, government agencies, through to SMEs, through to, in some cases, private individuals. And you go and you look at that firm and you say, well, what are you saying no to? And actually, it's very little. So in that, and you reflect, you look at those firms, and actually, by and large, some of them have been very successful. They've continued to grow. They continue to have a great culture. They continue to have good profitability. So yes, no, in one level in terms of market focus and sharp focus on sort of who you're working with. But those firms do say no to some things. And so, for example, from a cultural perspective, in terms of who they may hire, for example, if they do a lateral hire, they're super choosy as to who joins the firm.
That's right. And who's on board, so to speak.
Who's on board, exactly. And again, in terms of behavioral things, in terms of how people behave, they're quite intolerant of certain sort of behaviors. And so the sort of what you do and don't do is not always
Just
applied
clients.
in a market sense, because you find these firms that do all things to all people.
Yeah.
And they've proven to be super successful, but that there is that sense of focus and choosing a particular way of behaving and choosing a particular culture, and that's perhaps where they have a Michael Porter, select.
And because the partnership model isn't going anywhere, this point you make around the empowerment and bringing people with you and keeping them in the tent because of the nature of businesses within businesses and that partnerships promote. I mean, I've seen that play out well and badly in legal practice.
Again, it goes back to that shared power thing that I talked about, that it's a really subtle thing. And when I see it, played out well. So one of my clients for the last 20 years is Hall & Wilcox, and I know you've interviewed Tony McVean previously, and that firm exemplified this idea of being strongly led from the center. So, it was quite clear on its core purpose and vision, with a resolute focus around its hallmarks and so what is important in terms of from a behavior perspective, but at the same time allowed partners a fair degree of autonomy. So there's, individual partners felt that they could go forth and build their practice, that they had a level of discretion. They weren't just these sort of glorified employees or cogs in a wheel. They could exercise their own sort of flair and individuality. But also, and Tony was particularly good at that in trying to create the sense of a partnership, and had lots of sort of social activity and events. Partners gathered together at least twice a year. They had monthly partner meetings, and even those, when it's suddenly you got up to 120, 130, 140 partners, they really just became one-way communication as opposed to an interactive session. Still, they persisted on trying to make sure people felt part of the collective, that the firm came together around some key things, and there was super transparency. Tony had a weekly newsletter from his, an email that went out to everyone around what's going on. And so there's, again, this very strong sense of creating that sense of whole. So a brilliant example in my mind around a firm being strongly led, so directive power, but also with the collective.
Yeah. We have to kick down the road to another day because it could be a whole new podcast, remuneration models, seeing that they align with cultural attributes and how that can go pear-shaped for firms very quickly. We might have a brief comment on that and then I'll move on, Joel.
Yeah, look, it's a fascinating time. We could really spend a lot of time, but just some general comments quick just for this short podcast. But there's a continuum, as you know, of remuneration models, from at the one end, much more sort of collective, equal share type models, and sort of generally colloquially referred to as lockstep type firms, and through to much more individualistic, meritocratic firms. Right at the extreme of that is sort of eat what you kill. Mm-hmm. And there's a range of models in between. As a general trend, what's happening in the Australian market is that the firms who've had models right at those extremes are actually moving more towards the middle. So, for example, from lockstep firms, they feel that their model doesn't have much flex. So if you've got a big partnership with a wide range of different practices, some are more profitable than others, but also diverse people with different aspirations, interests, and needs, and you're getting everyone to, have to perform at a certain, level or contribute in a similar way. Well, it makes it very inflexible and very hard. So the lockstep firms find it inflexible. And again, the pure sort of financial meritocracies on the other side are seeing that, they can be rewarding cultural terrorists. So
yeah.
If it's just money that matters and they have no means to sort of...
That's a positive sign. And I think with new generations joining legal services and a desire for that flexibility, it'll be interesting to see where firms go. I think it's a good move going more to the centre. I think, as you say, the cultural terrorists, I've never heard it put in those terms. is a real problem with individualistic style meritocracy, and yet the other kind of can breed the old clubby world that doesn't allow succession, doesn't drive change.
But operating in the middle of that continuum is complex because you've got to then make judgments around relative contributions. You've got to make judgments around sort of soft subjective factors. And so your remuneration governance model becomes much more important and more difficult and harder to work with. So there's no sort of easy way around it. But just linking some earlier comment to that, and actually one of the interesting things I think that's going to play out is Gen AI is going to potentially impact some practices much more radically than others. And so, for example, if you have a lockstep firm or equal share firm, and in the next 3-4 years, suddenly you see this differential of contribution coming into play much more significantly because of the operating model, you'll see some of those firms quite challenged by, if they don't have enough flex in their model, and Gen AI comes in and creates much more variation in profit contribution, I think those firms are going to be quite severely challenged.
Well, Joel, you took the words right out of my mouth because we have to leave soon, but we can't leave without talking about generative AI.
Yeah.
Obviously, we can look at the pricing disruption, and you've touched on that, the increased commoditisation of legal services. But I'm more optimistic than many because I think that the strategic partnership, personal advice, relationship imperative will become stronger in many ways, and clients will look for that value. So skills that were traditionally considered soft skills are perhaps more important in a new age.
Most definitely. And it's interesting. I partnered with a chap, Ray De Cruz. Ray runs a business called Performance Leader. They do performance management software for the legal market and other professional services. And he and I presented a paper at the Managing Partners Forum 6 years ago, which was called 2030, the Profoundly Human Law Firm. So this was 6 years ago. We mapped out the attributes of what this profoundly human law firm was in 2030. And actually, it's actually, you can go back and Google it if you want. It's pretty prophetic in a sense. It's not a bad. It wasn't a bad guess.
No, it's a very good guess, and I've thought a lot about it.
One of the points was that actually by 2030 there'll be technological parity, that actually all firms will have access to the same technology pretty much, and actually the advantage won't come through the tech, it'll come through how relationships are managed and how you manage sort of culture internally, but also obviously, the relationships with clients, but also with other advisors, that firms become truly collaborative in partnering with other, specialists in solving complex client problems.
Yeah, so that's right. So the world of complexity and partnership and disputes, for example, like my world of mediation, I thought about this, boy, am I jumping into a world of AI disruption? But it seems that those sort of skills are still very much at the fore in a brave new world.
I agree, and really the AI will impact practices that are time intensive with low judgment, and so some of these big very highly leveraged practices with these deep teams that do legal tasks and legal process work that doesn't involve a lot of judgment. Well, I think AI will disrupt those practices. Whereas, as you just mentioned, something like, mediation or some of the aspects of the dispute resolution work or the advocacy work, it's much more around the advice, the interactions, the problem solving. I just think AI will just be a complement and a help in that regard, making a few of the aspects of it a bit more efficient, but not really be disruptive in that sense.
But there will be some pricing disruption coming from clients, won't there, in terms of sophisticated clients understanding commoditization, legal services?
I do think so. I think that if I'm a client and the firm can do the work in a much more efficient way, I'd want to share in that efficiency dividend. And I think that clients will recognize that firms have to invest and also underwrite the advice. So they still have to sort of put their stamp on it. But at the same time, if something that took 2-3 weeks with a team of 30 people now takes 5 days with 3 or 4 people, clients will see through that and will want to extract an efficiency dividend, will want to pay less for that work, even if, as much as people sort of say, well, we need to now move to value pricing or just sell the benefits, not the inputs. I still think clients will want to pay less for that work.
Well, that's a topic for another day as well, and a whole new podcast, Generative AI. We've run out of time, sorry, Joel. I really appreciate your time and expertise. I'm very grateful for you coming on the podcast. You've had such a long journey with professional services. So where can we find you in terms of your work?
I'm Melbourne-based, but I work across Australia and New Zealand. And so if anyone wants to find me, just to put my name into Google and access my website and send me an email. I'm also part of an international group of law firm consultants called Edge International. And so currently working on 2 or 3 international engagements, which is quite exciting. And so doing a bit more work overseas as well, but also tapping into the experts in the UK and the US and picking up on some of those trends and developments. And I'd just to maybe as a final comment, just to say, generally speaking, Australia is pretty much matching it with the rest of the world as far as I can tell, particularly from a leadership and management perspective. It's quite sophisticated here and firms are quite agile and willing to embrace new ways of working, new ways of thinking. And whilst we often sort of knock the profession and knock law firms and knock partnerships as being anachronistic in a way, I actually think that we should be proud of the firms that we have in Australia. We have some outstanding firms. And if you look at the leadership of some of these big global firms, many of them are filled with Australian managing partners and corporate service leaders.
It's funny you should say that, Joel. I've had the opportunity of working in large national firms in the early part of my career and then a startup, and then we merged with an international firm. And I totally agree that Australian firms very much hold their own. They're well led in the main. We're quite adaptable and flexible in the way we approach the world. We're perhaps less staid and conservative. I totally agree. I think it was nice for me to join a UK-based firm because I really did see clearly that Australia can hold its own, as you say. So that's a good comment to end with. Thanks again, Joel. Check out Joel's work, guys. I really appreciate your time. I hope to stay in touch, and I look forward to your thoughts hopefully you'll put a video out for your thoughts of 2026 and predict what perhaps didn't transpire, but really appreciate your time and expertise, Joel. All the very best.
All the best.
Thank you.